Hello again. Welcome to the third part of this. Now, in this section, we're going to look at food chains, food webs, and energy flow. So, if we start off with just a simple food chain, this shows the order in which animals feed. So, every food chain in the world starts with the sun. The sun shines down on a plant, and the plant carries out photosynthesis. Now, the next thing that happens is the plant gets eaten. Let's say it's by a little green fly. Hi guys. Then the green fly might get eaten by a little ladybird, because ladybirds are actually carnivores. So even though they look like they want to be everybody's friends, they actually eat the little green flies. And then the ladybirds might get eaten by little birdies. I know that's a terrible looking bird, but sure, let's not worry about that. Oh god, it's awful. Oh, let's give it feet. That'll make it look okay, won't it? Oh, good grief, I've definitely drawn better birds than that. Anyway, so this is a food chain. Starts with the sun. Now, when the sun shines down on the plant, photosynthesis takes place and the plant can grow. So the plant grows and then the green fly feeds on it. The ladybird will then eat the green fly and the regular bird will eat the ladybird. Now, in ecology, there's lots and lots of different words we can use to describe the processes going on here. The first one is the sun shining down on the plant absorbing it, absorbing the sunlight, and using the energy to make food for itself is photosynthesis. The green fly feeds on the plant, the ladybird feeds on the green fly, and then the bird feeds on that. So these arrows actually represent what gets eaten by what. So the plant gets eaten by the green fly. Now it also shows the transfer of energy, which we'll talk about a bit later on. But before we get there, there's several words that we need to talk about. So firstly, in this food chain, there are 4 levels in the food chain. Now each level in the food chain is called a trophic level. So this is trophic level 1. This is trophic level 2. This is trophic level 3. And this is trophic level 4. Other words we can use to describe these are producers and consumers. Now, this plant is the only thing in this food chain that can photosynthesize and trap energy, so it is known as a producer. And all plants are producers. And it is their job to use sunlight. That's not how you spell sunlight. To photosynthesize and produce food for the consumers. So, plants are producers. The next thing that we could say is that because the plants get eaten by the green flies, this is the first thing that eats the plant, so this is a primary consumer. The green fly gets eaten by the ladybird, so the ladybird is a secondary consumer. And the bird eats the ladybirds, so it is a tertiary consumer. Now, as well as that, so we're saying that producers are always plants. The primary consumers are always herbivores because they will eat the plants. Then we can say that secondary consumers are usually carnivores, which means that they eat other animals, as are the tertiary consumers. Now, of course, most things don't eat just one organism. So actually a lot of these things may be omnivores. If you think of us, we eat meat, we eat plants, so we would be omnivores. So I guess it depends on what the food source you're talking about and also the food chain that you're looking at. But there's just some keywords that we can look at whenever we're thinking about food chains. Now if we look at this, here's a simple question. So we've got a simple food chain. Now, which term best describes each organism? The leaves are going to be the producers. The caterpillars would be the primary consumers. The blue tits would be the secondary consumers, and the kestrels are the tertiary consumers. Complete the trophic level under each picture. This is the first trophic level, second, third, and fourth. Which organism is a herbivore? So which one eats plants? Is the caterpillar. What is the source of energy in this food chain? Same as every food chain in the world, the sun. And then what do the arrows in a food chain represent? It is the transfer of energy and this is important, substances including carbon and nitrogen, which we're going to look at later on. Now, obviously, I said that humans can be omnivores, as can lots of other organisms. So this means that rarely are food chains really that useful to look at. What's more important to look at is one of these, a food web. So this is a little food web for a forest. Now in this, it basically shows the complex feeding relationships which can go on. So if we start here, we can look at tree leaves. Tree leaves would be the producers. They get eaten by the slugs. Slugs get eaten by the frogs. Frogs get eaten by grass snakes, and then grass snakes get eaten by the hawks. Now along the way there's lots of other things here. We can actually see here that the tree leaves actually get eaten by caterpillars and aphids, which are green flies. We can see here the frog doesn't just feed on slugs, it also feeds on worms. We can see here that the grass snake only eats frogs, but the grass snake itself gets eaten by foxes and hawks. Okay, so this gives us a better idea of what's actually going on in an ecosystem. And from this, we can actually predict what would happen if there was something which affected certain organisms. So for example, imagine a forest where all the frogs die out. What would happen to the other organisms? Well, what might happen is there might be more worms than usual because there's no frogs to eat them. There might be more slugs than normal because again there's no frogs to eat them and nothing else eats the slug. But there might actually be less grass snakes than normal. And if the grass snakes don't eat anything else, they might too die out. Which as a result might mean that there could be less hawks and less foxes because they would have less food. And because there's less food, there would be more competition. So this sort of gives us a lot of things to think about. But if we go back a step and just think about this in terms of food chains and energy transfer, in this, we can name different producers, primary consumers, and tertiary consumers. So, name 4 primary consumers. Remember, a primary consumer is something which eats producers. So the primary consumers are blackbirds, aphids, caterpillars, slugs, woodlice, woodborne beetles, and worms as well, actually. 3 secondary consumers, so they eat the primary consumers. So in this case, we've got producer, primary, secondary. We've got producer, primary, secondary, producer, primary. Ooh, so the blackbird's at 2 here. Interesting. And then we've got producer, primary, secondary. So as you can see here, there can be a lot of secondary consumers. 2 tertiary consumers, so producer, primary, secondary, tertiary. Then producer, primary, secondary, tertiary. So again, there's a few tertiary consumers here. From the food web, construct a food chain with 4 trophic levels. So we need a producer. So let's go for let's go for a fancy one. Let's go for the tree wood lice, spider, and then shrew. 1, 2, 3, 4 trophic levels. Name an omnivore, so something which eats other animals and plants. Let's pick, not the worm, let's pick the blackbird. And the reason for that is it eats worms and it eats wee fruits. Now, just one last thing to point out here. What you'll have noticed here is that because this shows complex food chains, we can actually see some organisms feed at more than 1 trophic level. If we take this blackbird here, it acts as both a primary consumer in this food chain and a secondary consumer in this food chain. The blue tit here also acts as a secondary consumer in this food chain and a tertiary consumer in this food chain. Now then, the next thing that we would look at is energy loss in food chains. So as we said, the little arrows in food chain represent the transfer of energy. And what you notice there is that energy or food chains are usually no longer than about 4 trophic levels. It's quite rare that you find food chains which have 5 or even 6 trophic levels. And the reason for that is energy is lost at each stage of energy transfer. So by the time you get to the last one, there is little energy left. Now, if we even look at right at the start, even the absorption of light energy by plants is not efficient. Usually less than 10% of the light energy hitting the leaves is converted to starch in photosynthesis. Now, there's several reasons for this. If we've got a little leaf here, what has to happen is the light has to shine down and it has to hit a chloroplast. The chloroplast has to trap the light energy and it has to photosynthesize with that. But with all this light, lots of it just doesn't get used in photosynthesis. And some of the reasons are that it misses the chloroplasts altogether. Some of the energy even reflects off the leaves, and some of the light passes through the leaf. So actually, the first step of a food chain, which was this step, is very inefficient. Now, even though it's really inefficient, it's still actually not that big a deal because pretty much there's a constant supply of light energy coming from the sun during the day. So it's not that big a deal. Even if plants are really inefficient at getting all the light which shines from the sun, it's fine because there's usually enough of it. And we know that there's enough because otherwise we all wouldn't be here. If there wasn't enough energy trapped from the plants or trapped from the sun by the plants, we just wouldn't be here. In the next little part then, the transfer of energy between plants and between animals of different trophic levels is usually between 10 to 20%. This means for every 100 grams of plant material available, only between 10 and 20 grams is built up in tissues in the herbivore's body, and the loss of energy is due to three main reasons. The first of which is that not all of the organism can be eaten. Now, if we're talking about the plant, the roots or the bark might not be available to be eaten. If we're talking about animals, parts of that might be fur, claws, or the skeleton might not be available to be eaten. As well as that, second reason, some of the energy in the organism cannot be digested, so energy is lost in feces, which is undigested food. And then finally, a lot of energy is lost in heat from respiration. Because remember, in the previous topic, we said that respiration was exothermic, so it releases a lot of heat, so energy is lost in this way. Now let's summarize all that. So we start with the food chain. All food chains start with energy from the sun, and then it's transferred through the food chain. So in this case, the sun shines down on the grass absorbs it using photosynthesis, the grass gets eaten by the grasshopper and transfers its energy and nutrients and things such as carbon and nitrogen to the grasshopper. Then the grasshopper gets eaten by the frog gets eaten by the snake, and energy is transferred through the food chain. Now, as well as that, we can give these little names. So this process is photosynthesis. These arrows represent feeding. We've got the grass as the producer, which traps the light energy and produces food for the consumers. The grasshopper is the primary consumer, frog is the secondary, and snake is the tertiary. Now, if we're looking at the transfer of energy, at each stage, energy is lost at every stage, and that's because respiration takes place. All of these things are living things, so all of them have to respire, so energy is lost at all stages. Now, I say some energy, it's actually loads of energy gets lost at each stage. Now, as well as that, we've got losses of energy between the sun and the grass. So remember we said this process was very inefficient. There's energy losses from the sun to producer because the light misses the chloroplasts. Some light reflects off the leaf and some light passes through the leaves. We have energy losses from the producer to the primary consumer because not all of the plant is eaten. For example, the roots and the bark. Not all of the plant can be digested. For example, the cellulose. So energy is lost in feces. And again, respiration takes place. So some energy is lost in that. Now, this part, we can actually group the energy losses from the primary to the secondary and energy losses from the secondary to tertiary together. The reason why energy is lost in these stages is because not all of the animal is eaten. For example, the skeleton, the fur, and the wings. Not all of it can be digested, or energy is lost in feces or in excretion. Those all count as the same thing. Energy is also lost in movement from each of the organisms, and energy is lost in heat from respiration. Now, this is a little question to do with energy flow. So if we start off with sunlight, it shines down on the grass. Grass uses it for photosynthesis and grows. It gets eaten by the rabbit. The rabbit uses that energy for growth. So whatever energy that rabbit was able to use for growth of new muscle and things like that, that gets eaten by the dog. And only 10% of the food eaten by the dog gets used for growth. Along the way, energy gets lost in feces, and also what's not shown here is energy gets lost in respiration. So let's go back to the start then. We start with 100% of sunlight, which is 1,000 units. Only 1% of that is trapped by the grass. 1% of 1,000 is 10 units. 99% of it is reflected or misses the chloroplasts or passes through the leaf. That rabbit comes along and eats the grass, and it gets 10% of the food eaten by the rabbit used for growth. Now that is 10% of this 10 units, so that's only 1 unit which the rabbit can actually use for growth. The rabbit gets eaten by the dog, and 10% of the food eaten by the dog is used for growth. So that's 10% of that 1 unit, so it's 0.1 unit. So that is a tiny, tiny amount which is available to the dog. And hopefully this will give you an idea why it's rare that you have more than 3 trophic levels or even 4 trophic levels in a food chain. Now, name 2 other carbohydrates found in grass leaves. Starch, glucose. So glucose is made in photosynthesis and it's converted to starch for storage. And you can also have cellulose, which is used to make cell walls. If 1,000 units of energy fall in the grass plant, how many units of energy will trapped as carbohydrate in the grass? Now we said that there was 1,000 units. The grass only traps 1%, so 1% of 1,000 units equals 10 units. How much of the original 1,000 units of energy will be converted to compounds in the rabbit's body, which eats the grass? So if the grass has 10 units, the rabbit uses 10%. So 10% of 10 units equals 1 unit. So how much of the original 1,000 units of energy will become part of the body of the dog after it eats the rabbits? So in other words, how much of that energy is used for growth? The dog gets 10% of the rabbit's 1 unit, so the dog gets 0.1 unit. My dog obviously heard about this, so he's jumped up to see who's getting rabbits to eat. Is it me? Am I getting rabbits or chicken? So, why does a food chain contain no more than 4 organisms? Because energy is lost at each trophic level. So, there is not enough energy not enough energy as you get to the last level. Which carbohydrate is more likely to form the bulk of feces produced by the rabbit? It's going to be cellulose, because most organisms are not very good at digesting it. Why is there so much of the carbohydrate in a rabbit's feces? Because they can't digest it. Explain why less of the energy eaten is lost in the feces of the dog than those. Now, what this part means is, why is there more energy in the feces of the rabbit than the feces of the dog? And you've got to compare what they're eating. The rabbit is eating the grass. So there's quite a lot of the grass which cannot be eaten, like for example the roots, or it can't be digested, for example the cellulose. Whereas if you're looking at what the dog is eating, the dog's eating a rabbit, which is mostly going to be the meat. So there's more of the rabbit which can be eaten and more of the rabbit which can be digested. So rabbits eat grass, which contains lots of cellulose, which it can't digest. So it goes into its feces. Whereas the dog eats rabbits, which is easier to digest. So it wastes less energy in feces. And that is the end of this topic. The last one we've got to do for ecology part 1 is all about ecological pyramids. Bye bye.